The Dark Scrolls. Imagine a queen so powerful she bent nations to her will, yet so revoltingly unhygienic she could empty a banquet hall just by lifting her skirt hem. Yes, dear reader, welcome to the aromatic world of Queen Elizabeth I, where royalty met rancid in a head-on collision. If you thought medieval peasants were the only ones skipping soap, let's set that illusion ablaze. Her Majesty herself was a champion of questionable cleanliness, proudly cultivating a collection of odors that could, by today's standards, qualify as chemical warfare. Let's start with the first stomach-churning fact. Elizabeth I almost never bathed. Not once a week, never. More like twice a year if you're lucky. In an era when plumbing was primitive and heating water was an Olympic-level feat, she insisted that a full-body wash was both dangerous and unnecessary. Her courtiers recorded that she would taketh the tub only if she felt particularly unwell or was preparing for an especially important event, say negotiating with a foreign envoy or posing for an immortalizing portrait. Otherwise, she preferred what we might politely call the layering method, which is exactly as disgusting as it sounds. Picture it: sweat, perfume, body oils, and the remnants of meals she'd nibbled between councils all building up in a thickening glaze. But before you judge too quickly, remember, Elizabeth wasn't alone. Many nobles believed that water opened the pores to disease, so in her mind, her reluctance to bathe was an act of prudence, not just laziness. But the result? The Virgin Queen was, by modern reckoning, a walking biohazard. Still, she did care about masking that perpetual cloud of funk. And this brings us to habit number 2. She invented her very own special perfume, made from her own urine. Yes, you read that correctly. Elizabeth I literally soaked her garments with diluted human waste, believing the ammonia would neutralize odors. Imagine the queen perched in her chambers, a maidservant holding a basin as she contributed her personal ingredient, then swirling it with rose water, lavender, or clove. The final concoction was dabbed behind her ears and along the edges of her bodices. She believed the sharp scent would cleanse the air. In reality, it only layered stinging ammonia over the pungency of an unwashed body, like spritzing Febreze on a rotting carcass. Needless to say, visitors often complained of an indescribable tang that clung to the tapestries, drifted through the corridors, and settled like a curse in the upholstery. But Elizabeth considered this an acceptable price for what she thought of as natural disinfection. If the smell of the Queen's homemade cologne didn't make you gag, her third hygiene offense certainly will. She almost never changed her clothes. Some reports claim she sometimes wore the same gown for weeks at a time, even months. The logic was partly financial. Silks and velvets were costly and required special handling, but also superstition. It was thought that too much undressing invited illness, and frequent laundering wore garments thin, so she preferred to air out her gowns rather than have them properly washed. Courtiers documented entire wardrobes stained with sweat, flecked with old food, and marked by powder from her cosmetics. Those elaborate ruffs and gowns that looked so regal in portraits were often stiff with grime up close. The embroidery along the collar might conceal not only pearls, but crusted remains of dinners, the resin from her pomanders, and the natural oils seeping through every stitch. One courtier is said to have discreetly requested permission to burn a dress she'd retired because the smell was impossible to neutralize. That's right, Elizabeth's outfits could clear a room even when she wasn't wearing them. But surely, you might think, she at least kept her hands clean. Wrong again. That leads us to habit number 4. Instead of soap, Elizabeth preferred to wash her hands with alcohol, usually spiced wine or vinegar. In fairness, soap in Tudor England was a luxury item, often harsh and lye-based, and vinegar did kill some bacteria. But she saw soap as coarse and unrefined, so her alternative was to dip her fingertips in shallow bowls of wine, swirl them around, and dab them with a cloth. Imagine preparing to handle state papers or receiving the Spanish ambassador with fingers sticky from dried wine and whatever else she'd touched during the day. On ceremonial occasions, she would have a perfumed handkerchief to disguise any lingering foulness, but that was more for show than genuine sanitation. And yet, if her hands were questionable, her hair was a full-fledged ecosystem. Habit number 5. Elizabeth rarely combed or washed her famous red mane. Instead, she powdered it to keep it looking bright and brushed it infrequently to avoid breakage. The result? Lice colonies the size of armies. Even in an age when everyone had some degree of infestation, hers was notorious. Maids spent hours picking the tiny invaders out of her hair and wigs. Contemporary observers wrote that the Queen's hair was much admired in its color, yet her head was as a garden of little creatures. When the lice grew too numerous, she simply ordered more powder and pinned her hair up tighter so they'd have fewer escape routes. You might think a sovereign with her resources would summon the best remedies of the day, herbal salves or thorough washings, but no. Powder, tight braids, and more powder were her solution. This meant the top layer looked passably neat, while the hidden parts seethed with life. We're only halfway through, but already the Virgin Queen's hygiene reads like a horror story. In many ways, she was a paradox, famously vain about her image, yet profoundly neglectful of basic cleanliness. Her daily routine was a fascinating mixture of superstition, thrift, and cosmetic obsession. And her hair was just the beginning of her peculiar beauty regimen. If you thought lice-ridden hair and ammonia perfume were the pinnacle of Tudor-era filth, buckle up, because we haven't yet explored Elizabeth's most lethal beauty secret. Habit number 6. She painted her face with a poisonous white paste made from lead. That's right. Her Majesty was essentially embalming herself alive, one layer at a time. This infamous concoction was called Venetian ceruse, a paste of white lead mixed with vinegar. The look it produced was ghostly, almost luminous. In portraits, Elizabeth glowed like a porcelain doll, eerily smooth, with no trace of blemish or age. The price of that flawless complexion? Heavy metal poisoning that slowly ate away her skin. The logic behind this grotesque beauty hack was partly cultural. Pale skin was the ultimate status symbol. It meant you were aristocratic enough never to work outside in the sun. But in Elizabeth's case, the motivation also included concealment. She'd survived a bout of smallpox that left her cheeks pitted and scarred. Rather than show a single imperfection, she buried her face under thick layers of lead paste. Imagine the daily ritual, a lady-in-waiting scooping out a glistening dollop of ceruse, smearing it over the Queen's already inflamed skin, patting it smooth, then dusting it with yet more powder so no redness peeked through. Over time, the paste caused her flesh to crack and ooze. But Elizabeth was so committed to the illusion that she refused to abandon her regimen, even as her complexion deteriorated. If that wasn't hazardous enough, she topped the white mask with rouge made from cinnabar, a mercury compound. So while she conquered empires abroad, she was effectively poisoning herself at home. When foreign dignitaries bowed before her, they were saluting a woman whose skin was decaying beneath her regal paint. And what about her breath? You might think someone with an empire's wealth would have had access to herbs, mint, or even rudimentary tooth powders. And she did, yet her solution was as bizarre as the rest of her habits. Habit number 7. Elizabeth was obsessed with pomanders, little scented balls she'd clutch or hang around her neck to sweeten the air she breathed. To make matters more alarming, she sometimes tucked them discreetly in her mouth, like a grotesque breath mint. Pomanders were crafted from beeswax blended with musk, civet, a secretion from a cat-like animal's glands, and an array of spices. The scent was cloying, an almost suffocating sweetness designed to obliterate any trace of the Queen's unwashed mouth. After all, dental hygiene in Tudor England was a nightmare. She consumed vast quantities of sugar, leading to blackened teeth and frequent decay. The chronicles record that Elizabeth's teeth grew so compromised she often struggled to chew. To offset the odor, she simply popped a pomander onto her tongue or held it between her teeth. Imagine the Queen sitting on her gilded throne, conducting affairs of state, while her mouth held a waxy orb reeking of civet and cloves. Dignified? Perhaps in her mind. Repulsive? Absolutely. But the horrors didn't end there. From the crown of her head to the tips of her dainty slippers, Elizabeth's hygiene choices defied belief. Which brings us to habit number 8. She wore shoes so stifling that her feet practically marinated in their own brine. Elizabeth favored narrow leather shoes and high, padded chopines, platforms that kept her skirts clear of the mud. These shoes were rarely cleaned or aired, and she insisted on wearing heavy stockings underneath, believing they protected her from earthly humors. In practice, this meant her feet spent entire days and sometimes weeks sealed inside a damp, dark microclimate. Those close to her claimed the odor was unforgettable, an acrid staleness that wafted up whenever she changed clothes. At the height of summer, maids would discreetly sprinkle herbs near the footstools, hoping to neutralize the smell, but nothing could fully erase it. Imagine stepping into an antechamber perfumed with lead, vinegar, stale silk, and the rank bouquet of unwashed royal feet. Courtiers must have needed iron stomachs just to survive an audience. And as if her shoes weren't revolting enough, Elizabeth's hands were their own miniature disaster zone. Habit number 9. She grew her fingernails to conspicuous lengths, believing they enhanced her regal image. In portraits, she posed with her fingers curled delicately, as though to display them. But in reality, those elongated nails became filthy repositories of everything she touched: food particles, powder residue, ink smudges, and who knows what from her rarely scrubbed surroundings. One observer remarked, only half in jest, that the Queen's nails could be scraped for samples of the last week's meals. They were rarely clipped. Instead, she ordered them gently filed and occasionally polished with a cloth dipped in rose oil, never properly washed with soap. At feasts, she'd gesture dramatically with those grime-tipped fingers, oblivious to the collective nausea she inspired. And finally, there was habit number 10, the crowning jewel of her uncleanly routines, Elizabeth's infamous body cloths. Rather than bathe, she wiped herself down with a set of linen towels that were only laundered occasionally. Picture this: a small pile of hand-sized cloths folded neatly in a cedar chest. Each morning she selected one, moistened it with a dash of perfumed water, and scrubbed her face, arms, and neck. Then she'd return the damp cloth to the pile for reuse. Over time, the linens developed a smell that mingled with the other noxious aromas in her chambers. Servants dared not complain. They were sworn to preserve the Queen's dignity, or perhaps their own noses were so desensitized they no longer noticed. Through it all, Elizabeth remained supremely confident. In her mind, she was the epitome of refinement, brilliant, immaculate, above reproach. Her courtiers, meanwhile, perfected the art of holding their breath. Yet despite every putrid habit, she retained a magnetic authority. This paradox, filth wrapped in magnificence, was perhaps her greatest triumph. It proved that power, not hygiene, defined a monarch's legacy. So how, you might ask, did a monarch so caked in lead paste, so marinated in vinegar and urine, so infested with lice and hidden stenches, manage to project the image of a near-divine ruler? The answer is as complex and as unsettling as Elizabeth herself. Because while her hygiene habits were enough to make even hardened courtiers gag, her political instincts were sharper than any dagger. She knew precisely how to weaponize her appearance. The towering wigs, the alabaster face, the starched ruffs that created a halo around her head. Together they formed a visual spectacle so commanding, so dazzling, that most people simply overlooked the rot beneath. And therein lay the genius. Imagine the queen gliding into her presence chamber, her skirts hissing across the rush-strewn floor, a hush falling over the courtiers who'd spent hours rehearsing the correct angle of their bows. From a distance, she was perfection incarnate, a living symbol of England's imperial ambitions. The glowing skin, even if it was lead, the red gold hair, even if it was a wig swarming with lice, the jeweled fingers, even if the nails were stained. Up close, though, the illusion began to fray. The lead paste cracked when she spoke. A hint of sourness, vinegar, sweat, and decaying tooth enamel rose every time she exhaled, and if she extended her hand in greeting, one could glimpse the grime lodged beneath each nail. Yet no one dared recoil. To be in the queen's favor meant power, wealth, and safety. To be out of it meant disgrace or worse. So courtiers trained themselves to ignore the odors, the smears on her linen cuffs, the damp towels drying on the back of her chair. This iron-willed denial was perhaps the strangest aspect of all. And it wasn't only her own staff who bore witness to these unholy scents and sights. Foreign ambassadors were equally stunned, though they couched their horror in polite euphemisms. One Venetian envoy, after an audience, wrote cautiously that Her Majesty's complexion is most fair and bright, though her countenance bears traces of her exertions. Translation: she was sweating profusely under pounds of lead, and he nearly fainted. The French envoys had similar observations. They admired her intellect and political acumen, but noted, delicately, that the Queen, in her closeness to her people, embraces a natural state. Natural, indeed, a state of perpetual filth. But Elizabeth never wavered in her conviction that she was the apex of civilization. Her hygiene rituals, if you could call them that, were expressions of her power over nature itself. She did not need to bathe like a peasant. She did not need to clip her nails or air her shoes. Her body was not subject to ordinary rules, and in a sense she was right. Her entire reign was built on projection. The bright white mask that slowly poisoned her was the same mask she wore politically, a facade of invincibility. Her court became a theater where everyone pretended not to see the lice, the lead, the clinging layers of rancid perfume. Consider her mornings. As the sun rose over the palace roofs, Elizabeth's ladies would tiptoe into her chambers, holding their breaths. They peeled back the velvet bed curtains and found her already awake, propped among her cushions. Her hair, or rather the day's chosen wig, rested on a stand nearby, dusted with powder and perhaps a few insects. One maid prepared the basin of vinegar for her fingertips. Another unfurled the cloths she used to wipe her face, some faintly stained from the previous days. A third arranged the jars of ceruse and rouge, ready to reconstruct her iconic visage. First, the queen dabbed her cheeks with a perfumed cloth, never rinsing, merely smearing yesterday's lead into a fresh base. Next, she pressed the white paste into the cracks along her jaw. Finally, she patted on powder and drew her lips in thin, vivid lines. The transformation was mesmerizing, the tired, blemished woman disappearing under a theatrical mask of power. But while her face was reborn each dawn, the rest of her remained largely unchanged. Her gowns, sometimes weeks between cleanings, exhaled their unique blend of aged silk, body oils, and the ammonia tang of her homemade perfume. She stepped into her shoes, encasing her feet once more in the same damp darkness, and settled her pomander in the hollow of her palm or pressed discreetly between her teeth. And so began another day in Elizabeth's England, a realm where appearance ruled and reality was best ignored. But even the queen could not fully escape consequences. Over the years, the lead gradually eroded her skin. Observers noticed her increasingly frequent mood swings, her fits of melancholy, her trembling hands. Many historians today suspect lead poisoning contributed to her decline. The very substance that made her beautiful in the eyes of her court was also killing her. Her teeth decayed until she could hardly chew. Her breath became so foul that foreign visitors whispered about it in letters home. And her once glorious red hair, what little remained under the wigs, grew thin and brittle. Yet, to the end, she never surrendered the rituals. She died as she had lived, hidden beneath powder and perfume, her flaws entombed in a shell of gleaming white. And this, perhaps, is what makes her story so morbidly fascinating. It's not simply that Elizabeth thus had revolting hygiene habits. It's that she turned those habits into a kind of armor. They were evidence of her power to dictate her own reality. While the peasants scrubbed themselves in wooden tubs, terrified of disease, Elizabeth remained serene in her filth, believing it was a privilege of royalty. She reigned longer than any English monarch before her, defeated the Spanish Armada, and presided over an age of exploration and cultural flowering. And she did it all while exuding a stench that could knock a grown man senseless. In the end, her legend endured, while the memory of her lice, her lead mask, and her sour linens slowly faded into historical footnotes. Until, of course, someone like you decides to peek behind the velvet curtain. And there you have it, the full, unvarnished tale of Queen Elizabeth I's 10 most revolting hygiene habits. Bathing only a handful of times each year, believing water invited disease. Brewing her own perfume from her urine to mask the rank smell of unwashed skin. Wearing the same gowns until they practically stood up on their own. Washing her hands with vinegar or spiced wine instead of soap. Allowing lice to colonize her rarely combed hair, painting her face with poisonous white lead, which eventually destroyed her skin, tucking pomanders into her mouth to conceal rotting teeth and fetid breath, sealing her feet into unventilated shoes that never dried out, growing her fingernails into grime-trapping talons, relying on reusable cloths to clean her body, seldom washing them properly. It's a testament to how power can override even the most fundamental revulsions, because no matter how pungent she grew, no matter how visible her decay, Elizabeth I remained the Virgin Queen, beloved by her people, feared by her enemies, and immortalized in the portraits that never betrayed the truth beneath the paint. And that, dear reader, is the paradox of royalty. The ability to command awe, even while leaving behind a legacy of unforgettable stench. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.